This is Cliff Kip. He's the executive director of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. That's Smoke Elser over there. And this is Eva-Maria Maggi. She is the author of the book. As I hope you know, today marks the 60th anniversary of the signing of the 1964 Wilderness Act. It was signed September 3rd, 1964.
Exactly why we chose this date and wanted to invite you all here and to hear some wonderful stories from the results of that act. We would be remiss not to acknowledge First Nations, people who walked, traveled, worked, and recreated in these lands well before we did. We follow in their footsteps to Amskapi Pekani, Kalispe, Tanaha, and Sims.
I was talking to Smoke the other day, and there were details of the wilderness history that he thought were important to share. In 1931, the South Fork of the Flathead Primitive Area was established by the U.S. Forest Service. In 1933, the Pentagon Primitive Area was established and added on to in 1939. In 1934, the Sun River Primitive Area was established. In January of 1935, the Wilderness Society was founded by Aldo Leopold, Bob Marshall, and several others. At the time, forests and other public lands were mainly seen as resources for logging, mining, and other development. Setting out to conserve the wildest places was a revolutionary idea. On August 16, 1940, Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace combined the primitive areas to form the Bob Marshall Wilderness. This was not a congressionally designated wilderness. It would have been easy for the next secretary to change the management rules. In 1956, Cliff Merritt, Wilderness Society Western Director from Kalispell, had the idea to make the Bob a congressionally designated wilderness. Howard Van Slyzer wrote the first draft of what was to become the 1964 Wilderness Bill. In the next several years, there were over 60 rewrites and 18 congressional hearings for what was to become the 1964 Wilderness Act. During all the rewrites, Tom Edwards and Howard Copenhaver got involved to make sure stock would be allowed in the wilderness. Tom and Howard were the first outfitters Smoke worked for. They got Smoke engaged in wildland conservation. He's been involved ever since. In 1958, the Montana Wilderness Association was formed, and Smoke is a charter member.
The next date is September 3rd, 1964, when President Johnson signed the Wilderness Act, establishing 54 wilderness areas and protecting over 9 million acres in 13 states, and that included the Bob Marshall, which is over 1 million acres at the time. Today, there are over 800 wilderness areas in the U.S. And Puerto Rico. That's 111 million acres in 44 states. Here in Montana, we have 15 wilderness areas amounting to just about 3.5 million acres. So back to the timeline, in 1972, almost 260,000 acres of the South Fork, or sorry, the southern end of the Bob were designated as the scapegoat. Smoke could probably tell you 100 different stories about that process and his role there. Certainly played a significant role. First citizen-led, congressionally designated wilderness in the country.
In 1973, the backcountry horsemen started here in the Flathead. And in 1974, the second chapter started in Missoula, and Smoke is a charter member of that chapter. And it has since spread to 210 chapters in 35 states.
Smoke also had a hand in the establishment of the Great Bear. The Great Bear is about 286,000 acres on the north end of the Bob. That was established in 1978. It's a really, really interesting story. You should check that out. Great Bear Wild River is a wonderful telling, but also we have the man here. He can tell you his own stories about that. And that's really important because that safeguarded the headwaters of the Middle Fork of the Flathead. In 1996, the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation was formed to support the Forest Service in their stewardship activities and do what we could to maintain that 2,200-mile trail system, which now is about 1,700 miles for lack of maintenance.
In 2013, the Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Act, Smoke stood up again to help protect the wild country. This protected the wildland on the east side of the Bob. This brought the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex to 1.6 million acres. In 2018, Montana Conservation Elders was formed, and they're a sponsor here this evening. Smoke is a charter member of that as well. MCE envisions a robust constituency of young people involved in conservation in Montana. These future defenders will actively get involved in protecting and maintaining our public lands. Out of that came a group called Montana Conservation Next Gen, which formed in January of this year. They were also a sponsor. The very first meeting was held in Smoke's Barn. Next Gen is a branch of the Montana Conservation Elders and is a coalition of friends, young and old, striving to provide young people with tools and experiences to become effective stewards of the land. Everyone is welcome. Come and see us at our table in the foyer. I'm going to say a little bit more about the backcountry horsemen. What backcountry horsemen do is they keep the traditional use of horses and mules in the backcountry. This means you ride and pack our stock in the backcountry like it's been done for several hundred years. We do this by clearing trails, packing supplies and tools for trail crews, packing bridge planks, propane, and other things the Forest Service needs. We have rebuilt a lot of the trailheads in the Flathead, and we're just starting on a project to bring water to the Meadow Creek Trailhead. We also have educational opportunities for everyone. If you'd like to learn more about horses and packing, please come see us. Everyone is welcome. We also have a table up in the foyer. And also, we'd like to thank the FBCC Natural Resources and Conservation Program. They were also a sponsor this evening. This class gives students a look into the conservation world. Smoke is a legendary packer, author, teacher, and conservationist who has traveled the trails of the 1.6 million acres of the Bob Marshall Wilderness on horseback for 60 years. As a professional wilderness outfitter, he provided a once-in-a-lifetime experience deep in the mountains for thousands of people, of whom many had never been on a horse before. U.S. Navy SEALs, U.S. Army, U.S. National Park Service, and U.S. Forest Service, as well as thousands of civilians and college students, have taken his famous horse and mule packing class. He is co-author of the leading textbook on horse and mule packing, Packing In on Horses and Mules. His skills, life, and persistent work to preserve our public lands and wilderness for future generations has been featured in the PBS documentary, 3 Miles an Hour, in National Geographic articles, The Guardian, New York Times, and the Washington Post, among others. Smoke is the recipient of many awards, among them the 2023 Distinguished Alumni Award of the University of Montana, Distinguished Citizen Award of the Boy Scouts of America, and the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Backcountry Horsemen of America, and also the Conservation Roundtable. He is honored to be the only inductee of both the Montana Outdoor Hall of Fame and Montana Cowboy Hall of Fame. He lives with his wife, Thelma, dog Spunky, horses and mules in Missoula, Montana.
Word about Eva-Maria Maggi, a writer, teacher, and packer. Her new book, Hush the Land, we're profiling tonight, which she wrote in partnership with Smoke here. She holds a PhD in political science and teaches wilderness policy and packing at the University of Montana. Her research on Europe and Middle East was published as the book, The Will of Change, and in several academic journals, newspapers, and magazines. She grew up in Germany, lived in Italy and Morocco, and now calls Missoula home. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Is that good? Thank you, Greg and Cliff, for that wonderful introduction and all you do for Wild Places. And thanks also to the Flathead Valley Community College program for natural resources conservation and management for inviting Smoke and I today to celebrate 60 years of the Wilderness Act. What a special date. I also want to thank Thelma, of course, here in the front row, without who this book wouldn't exist, and Tammy, Smoke and Thelma's daughter, right there, and Deb Schatz, who also, all three of you read this book first page to last and helped us make it what it is. So today is the celebration of the Wilderness Act, but a few days ago we had also a very special celebration, and that was the anniversary of Smoke and Thelma. So they are married now for 66 years. Congratulations. So special, inspiring. So today is a special day, and I can really only imagine one place Smoke and I would rather be to celebrate the wilderness. Do you know where, Smoke? Where would you rather be?
Yeah, I'd rather be in than Bob Marshall.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Primarily Cabin Creek on the east side.
Right, on the back of the horse somewhere in the Bob Marshall. That's true. So the Wilderness Act was written at a different time. Today, 60 years ago, President Johnson put 8 million acres of wildlands under permanent protection by Congress with a stroke of his pen. It was just a few months after he signed the Civil Rights Act into law, and a little bit less than a year after his predecessor, President Kennedy, who was deeply involved in both bills, was shot. So although the Wilderness Act, like so many bills at the time and today, was the work of hard-fought compromise, a lot of people didn't have a voice in the process. So after it was passed, some fought even harder to have one, and they succeeded. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, motivated by three remarkable women with strong convictions, used some ideas of the Wilderness Act to set aside the first tribal wilderness in the nation right here in the Mission Mountains. The act motivated thousands to work for more protections for the land they loved, connected to, and respected across Montana and the nation. So without the Wilderness Act, Smoke and I'm guessing many of you, wouldn't be sitting here today. So instead of the trail that Smoke rode on his first pack trip in the Bob Marshall more than 60 years ago, a train might take you up the North Fork of the Blackfoot River towards the Danaher Valley. I would imagine a small, beautiful, highly desirable mountain town with a private airplane strip and houses none of us could afford. There may never been a river runs through it because hydroelectric dams would inhibit the world-class trout habitat that Bob Marshall is famous for today. But you could take some turns at the ski area the Forest Service had planned to permit on Scapegoat Mountain and drive up with your car to Webb or Heart Lake and camp without having to walk far. I'm sure there would be many tracts of private land inaccessible for anyone to hunt, fish, see a wolverine, lynx, elk, or grizzly bear, if they would even still live there. Because of the Wilderness Act, we can experience this land not as separate, exotic, or remote from us, although it might feel that way at first for many people today without a car, hotel, or ski area close by. Below these mountains, we all shrink to the appropriate size and understand that the land as a sovereign, sacred place, worthy of our hard-fought protection and respect. There would be no need for mules without a Wilderness Act. The mules, the semi-truck of the backcountry, or a guide like Smoke to bring people into the mountains that would otherwise never visit. Instead of becoming the outfitter exactly 60 years ago, Smoke might have been the forester he wanted to be when he first came to Montana from Ohio right after high school, or a train conductor, who knows? I certainly wouldn't be here. Smoke and I would have never met in his barn because I wanted to learn from him how to pack a mule, on a scholarship from the Backcountry Horsemen, by the way. Without the Wilderness Act, few people would pack mules anymore. There would be no need. Instead, I stepped in the old stone barn with the red doors in Missoula 8 years ago on a cold January morning, lots of snow on the ground, and it changed my life. 20,000 miles from where I grew up, I found a home and a unique friendship. So who in this room has taken Smoke's packing class? Hands up. So you know what a gifted teacher he is, and thousands of others know that too in this country and beyond. It took me a while to learn. Actually, that runs in the family, by the way, I noticed. Lots of good teachers in that family. It took me a while to learn the ropes, much longer than the Navy SEALs or the Special Forces, for sure. But I will never forget the first story I heard. It is called Mysterious Boxes in the book. And the story is so good, my hair still stands up when I think about what happened on the top of Jumbo Mountain in July 1969. And I knew in my heart what I had to do. Record these stories so others can experience the Bob Marshall Wilderness with Smoke, who might otherwise never will. So who in this room rode a horse alongside Smoke?
Yeah.
Just a few.
Greg has. Yeah.
I never did. But writing this book, I traveled every trail in the Bob Marshall Wilderness with him, so you can do too. I hope you enjoy. We recognize that all trails traveled in this book and beyond on the indigenous territories of the Blackfeet and Salish Kootenai people. May their wisdom carry the future of our wild places. So I will do something a little different today than we usually do at the readings. I will read a section of the beginning of the book, but not the first one. I will go a little bit further. And then Smoke will tell a few stories about his life in the Bob Marshall. Smoke had spent, so where I'm going to start reading, Smoke had spent already a few years in Montana, had married the love of his life, but had yet to own his own outfit. He's still working for Tom Edwards and his cousin Howard Copenhaver at the Whitetail Ranch near Ovando, Montana. The chapter is called A Mule, a Train, and the Fight for Wilderness. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, no worries. I'm just going to read a little bit. And a similar version of this is actually going to be published in the upcoming issue of the Montana Historical Society's Magazine of Western History. On a clear summer day in 1962, my pack string and I followed the trail up Headquarters Pass high above the eastern edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Each switchback was half a mile long, changing directions above steep rock cliffs. The view of the Sun River Valley and the Rocky Mountain front was expansive. A fresh wind came up from the eastern plains. Soon, we would be at the Gleason Ranch on the South Fork of the Teton River for dinner. I was looking forward to a hot shower in Choteau after 12 days in the mountains. That would have been good too. That would have been good too, yeah. My string of mules had just made it around the last switchback when a guest from New York City hollered behind me. "Wait, hold up, Smoke." I stopped. In the 4 years I had been working for Tom and Howard, my life had changed. I was married, had 2 daughters, and was close to finishing a college degree in forestry. I stayed at the Whitetail for the summers, Thelma and the kids joining me when they could. The rest of the year we lived in the Elmira Trailer Park in Missoula. Thelma and I had little time for ourselves, but enjoyed driving down Main Street in Missoula, sharing an ice cream cone for a date. Tammy was born in 1960 and Vicky followed 18 months later. The summers at the ranch were busy. I went on trips, learned about the country, fixed fence and equipment, worked with the stock, and helped with the hay. Thelma stayed with the girls and picked up work where she could, typing manuscripts for university professors and running a neighborhood daycare for a few kids. During those years, Tom and Howard didn't just teach me how to pack, hunt, and lead a trip. Working for them showed me that the wild places we traveled wouldn't stay wild just by chance, but by hard work of the people who cared about them. Tom and Howard had different ways to go about that. Tom was a man of words. He was good at talking, a great writer, and not afraid to speak up in front of people. Howard was a man of action and introduced me to mules. The guest from New York was riding one of Howard's favorite mules. Just 4.5 feet tall, Dodge City was narrow-built and really smart. We had bought him with a truck full of mules from Missouri 2 springs ago. His eyes were attentive but soft. We knew right away that we could pack and ride him, and named him after the town in our favorite radio and later TV show, Gunsmoke. Usually our guests rode horses, but when one went lame on the second day, Dodge City was our first choice. Howard had asked me to keep a close eye on the pair, and they followed my string until Dodge City stopped on the edge of the turn, his long ears pointed up. "You scenery-loving son of a gun," the guest yelled and laughed, but was also scared to death because on every switchback, the mule walked right up to the edge of the cliff, stopped, and swung his head side to side. The sun was high, the sky was blue, and Dodge City, the mule from Missouri, was taking in the scenery. At the Gleason Ranch, Ted, the other packer on this trip, and I turned the stock loose and enjoyed dinner from the Whitetail Ranch with cherries, peaches, apples, watermelon, and ice cream for dessert, and a hot shower in Choteau. The guests had left, and we could rest for a day before the new group arrived. Fresh and in good spirits, we walked half a mile above the ranch, laid the watermelon to cool in the creek, and rolled our sleeping bags where the trail narrowed from the open meadow. It was the ideal spot to chase the horses back to the ranch if they decided to run up the canyon. It was a warm evening, and the horses and mules were peacefully grazing in the meadow below. The air smelled like rain. Weather moves quickly so close to the eastern plains. Dark clouds appeared, and lightning hit a tree a mile up the mountainside from our camp. A small fire, but Kenny Gleason, the ranch owner, notified the Forest Service right away. At that time, they would try to put the fire out by 10 the next morning. The thunderstorm cooled the air. We watched the horses and the fire. In the back country, we would have had to put it out, but here the Forest Service would be quicker. Some mules were taking a bath, splashing by the creek. Then Dodge City came running out of the water. He carried a big watermelon with pink juice dripping out of both sides of his mouth. He was excited. Being from Missouri, he probably grew up eating watermelons. It took us a while to chase him down. We put what was left of the juicy fruit in a safer place. It was still warm, so we took off our clothes and climbed on our bedrolls. The horses and mules were grazing calmly down in the meadow, and we settled in for an easy night. At about 2 in the morning, we heard the horses trotting up the trail. We jumped out of our sleeping bags, put our cowboy boots on, and chased them back toward the ranch. An hour later, they were back. "Next time I'm taking my pistol," Ted said, "and we'll chase them down for good so we can get some sleep." And we went back to bed. At 4:30, we heard the bells again, this time farther down the meadow. Do you hear the clomping of the feet on the trail?" Ted asked. "Some of them are trying to sneak away from the belled horses. Smoke, get ready." Sitting on our sleeping bags, we slipped on our boots. I picked up a rock to bang it loudly on my empty water canteen when the time came. Ted's pistol lay in his lap. He wanted to shoot in the air and run the stock all the way back to the ranch for good this time. We could hear the horses come closer and closer, but Ted didn't get up. Finally, he rolled over and said, "Let's go get him." We jumped up and ran down the road in our underwear and boots, Ted shooting his pistol and me beating my canteen, both hollering as loud as we could. Then all hell broke loose. Mules were bucking, loads flying around, and a rider yelled, "Wait, I'm a Forest Service packer." His gear was scattered across the mountain, and his mules and crew were so scared they ran all the way back to down the ranch. "Boy, that sure was a mistake," Ted said, while we picked up their fire packs, Pulaskis, and groceries. Down by the ranch, Howard had caught the mules, but it was after 10 that morning when the Forest Service packer and his crew made it back up the trail. The 6 firefighters were now ready to put out the last night's fire. They had run with the mules all the way back to the ranch when they saw 2 guys coming running down the trail in their white underwear and cowboy boots shooting guns in the air. They thought something must have gone completely haywire. This wouldn't be our last run-in with the Forest Service that year, but the next time we were fully dressed. Back at the Whitetail Ranch, Tom started to have meetings with the owner of the general store in Lincoln, Cecil Garland. Road markers had appeared along the North Fork of the Blackfoot, and Cecil had heard of a plan by the Forest Service to develop the area north of Ovando and Lincoln with roads and campgrounds. He had founded the Lincoln Backcountry Protection Association to fight the project. I sat in the corner and listened as the two made plans on how to go about it. Tom had written his first letter to Montana's U.S. Representative Lee Metcalf and Regional Forester Percy D. Hansen in 1955, asking them to add the Lincoln Scapegoat Backcountry to the Bob Marshall Wilderness area, but to no avail. In 1940, the Forest Service had combined the South Fork, Pentagon, and Sun River primitive areas into one and named it the Bob Marshall Wilderness Area in tribute to the forester and conservationist Robert Bob Marshall, who had hiked most of it and died the previous year. Tom hoped for the same protection for his backyard. The Forest Service managed all areas surrounding the Bob Marshall as they saw fit, with little interest in discussing their plans with the public. After Tom's friend and my former boss, Dunk Moyer, retired as supervisor of the Helena National Forest in 1958, development of the Lincoln Scapegoat seemed unstoppable. But Tom and Cecil and others were determined to try. When the Forest Service finally presented the plan to the public on April 4th, 1963, 300 people packed the Lions Club in Lincoln, Montana, to voice their opposition. The other outfitters, Howard and I, sat in the back of the room, listening to what everybody had to say. Nothing seemed to make the Forest Service change its mind. One night after dinner at the Whitetail Ranch, Howard turned to me and said, "Smoke, grab a chainsaw and some gas." I put both back in the back of the truck. We drove north up the new road the Forest Service had built through our main pasture towards the North Fork of the Blackfoot. It looked like a major, yet unpaved highway, 32 feet wide and crowned for the snow to blow off and the rain to run into ditches. I knew the road well. I had spent the last 2 weeks building a mile of jack-legged fence along it so our stock wouldn't leave the pasture. We followed the road and stopped half a mile above the new concrete bridge that crossed the North Fork of the Blackfoot River. The road was the first visible sign of the larger project into the area where we brought our guests on horseback to find solitude. The development would include a scenic road from Ovando to Lincoln with drive-up campsites, boat launches on Webb and Hart Lake, and even a ski area by Scapegoat Mountain. The land around the Bob Marshall was to be logged, mined, and paved, and with it, our livelihood. When we got out of the truck, I noticed a large wooden sign on the hill with big letters that read, Lincoln Scapegoat Scenic Highway. A map showed the new road, cutting through our campsites, trails, and hunting grounds. Few words were spoken. We grabbed the chainsaw, walked up to the sign, cut the poles, and threw it off the backside of the hill. It tumbled toward the river and out of sight. Organized opposition to the logging and mining plans had grown all around the Bob Marshall as trust in the Forest Service waned. At Bunker Creek in the north, Jewel Basin in the west, and the Rocky Mountain Front to the east, meeting rooms and newspaper opinion pages filled with pleas to keep the rivers, mountains, and meadows around the Bob Marshall untouched. On the other side were logging and mining interests that saw missed economic opportunity and the Forest Service, which seemed to agree. At the Whitetail Ranch, we had heard about a bill in Washington, D.C. that would permanently protect all primitive areas as wilderness. The Forest Service surely seemed in a rush to make sure all other wildlands wouldn't qualify for such a level of protection. A memorial proposed by the Montana legislature asked the U.S. Congress to extend the Bob Marshall, but it was vetoed by Governor J. Hugo Aronson. Many more letters were written, and finally, U.S. Senator and then Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield asked the chair of the Agriculture Committee for a hearing on the issue. It was rescheduled because of the assassination of President Kennedy. The Wilderness Act passed in 1964 without including the Lincoln Scapegoat or any of the areas surrounding the core of the Bob Marshall. It would be up to us to change that with more letters and a train to Washington, D.C., carrying Dodge City, the mule, to his new home. Thank you.
I guess it's my turn. If I can get this thing on. There it is. There, can everybody hear me? Nope, not yet. Okay, can you hear? Yeah, you can hear me now. Yeah, first of all, First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I'll try to make this brief, but I'll try to give you some things that I remember very well in the Bob Marshall. So everybody, thank you for coming tonight. I know it's kind of the middle of the week and everything else, but this is one of the times we scheduled it. So thank you for coming. And I cannot talk without my hat on, so I'm going to have to put it on. And I want to introduce my wife, Thelma, right here. And my daughter, Tammy. And Tammy was a packer and worked for me for about 4 or 5 years, packing mules and doing all the work that we have to do. Yeah, cutting hair. Yeah. And there's one of my favorite horses. Anyway, Thelma, by the way, ran most of the outfit. So all I did is handle the mules and the horses, which I liked. And I spent the time in the hills. A lot of times I'd be in there for about 30 or 40 days at a time. And that's why I had to get a haircut from Tammy, because no way you get a barber in there. So that's the way it went. Now, I want to make sure that everyone understands that we have something that no one in the world has. We have a wilderness area that is protected by our government. And it's the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And it's the Wilderness Act, when it passed in 1964, was a great win for future generations, not just us, but for future generations. And I think it's a great thing that we have the wilderness. The wilderness areas all over. I've been in many of them, like the Gila down in New Mexico, which is fairly small, but you wouldn't want to go there. I don't think anybody here would, because everybody down there, they tie their horses right on the trail. So, and the trails are pretty rough and tough. And there's no water, by the way. And that's another thing. We have water. We have a lot of green areas and a lot of places to put our horses. so that they're out of the way and yet provide us with good transportation going into the Bob Marshall. Yeah, Cecil Garland and I and Tom Edwards worked a lot on getting the Lincoln Scapegoat Wilderness in. And then I got involved with the Great Bear with a guy by the name of, primarily with a guy by the name of Dale Burke, who was working for the Missoulian at that time. And he introduced me to another man from right here in this part of the country, Lauren Kreck. And Lauren, Dale, and I really worked on the Great Bear Wilderness to get it into a wilderness fashion so that we had more buffer zone around the heart of the Bob Marshall. So that's kind of how that got started. And Lauren did a lot of work on it. He walked a lot of it, but I rode a lot of it. And of course, so did Tom Edwards. And Dale Burke never rode a horse hardly, but he went to work for me for about 3 weeks and learned to be a packer. He didn't like that at all, but he wrote a lot of articles about the Great Bear. So we got that in. We're at a point right now where we have wilderness study areas all over the state. And these study areas are managed as wilderness, and I think that's a good thing. However, there's some of those areas may not be appropriate wilderness areas, but why do we call them study areas? And why hasn't somebody done anything about them? Here they've sat for years and years and years, and they just sit there. Now, I understood, at least from college, that when you study an area, you actually study it. You take a look at it and see what's good, what's the best way to use that piece of land. And so far, we haven't done much of that. We're going to have to start taking a look at that because, as you know, there's a lot more people now using the backcountry and using open space. They use open space in a whole lot of different ways, some to build a house in, and some of them to ride a bicycle in, and some of them to ride an ORV or an off-road vehicle in. Not too many of them anymore use horses. Horses and mules give you a real advantage. I always tell everybody, you know, there's nothing, I quote the head of England, what was his name? I can't remember right offhand. Huh? No. No, he was, in World War II, Churchill, stood up and he said, you know, there's nothing any better for the inside of a man than the outside of a horse. And I think I live by that motto yet, and still do. Because I think that's a good way to see it, the wilderness from 5 feet off the ground, probably, and where you don't have to watch where every foot is going to land. So that you can see it and let the horse do the driving like a Greyhound bus. And yet he can take you through that country where you can really observe it. Let's see. I think I'll tell a story or two real quickly here on Watch for Time. Somebody raise their hand when I'm getting. Greg, you know what to do. Just holler at me. But let's see. One of the stories that's not in the book that I'll tell you. And then I'll tell you, well, let me tell you one about the Middle Fork. That's right up here in this part of the country. The Middle Fork of the Flathead, which flows at the edge of Glacier Park. And the other part of it is in the Bob Marshall. So the University of Montana, a man by the name of Tom Collins, he called me into his office one day, and I had taken Tom and his family in the hills about 3 or 4 times. Prior to this, he loved to fish. And I mean, he really was a fisherman. He even had a watch that tell you when the fish were going to eat. I didn't believe it, but he would look at it. Oh, yeah, time to go. And he'd go out and catch fish. So I guess it worked. But I never could use a watch to tell that. But anyway, Tom called me up one day, and he was at that time in charge of the wilderness or the foundation for the university. And at that time, the university was just getting, a few $1,000s, maybe $100,000 here and there. to promote the university. He said, I got to figure out a way to get this foundation really moving. So I said, geez, we sat there, and he called me in, and we sat there and talked a little bit. And I said, hey, I got an idea. I said, why don't we take some of the graduates out of the university and take them on a pack trip into the Bob Marshall, 4 or 5 days. Not a real long pack trip. This is a fairly short pack trip. And let's let them bring, we'll invite 10 of those who have graduated and who have made some kind of success, running corporations or whatever they did. And let them bring one guest. So I'd make a party of 40 or 20. And I thought, boy, that's all I can handle at that time. And this, by the way, was in 1964, 65. Yeah, 65. And in the winter, 65, just before the snow started to melt in the backcountry. And Tom says, that's a great idea. He says, we ought to do that. So he contacted the president of the university, President Johns, and we started to look at places. And we picked Meadow Creek down on the southern end, which was in National Forest land, not the Lincoln Scapegoat yet. And they had 3 or 4 lakes there, and it was pretty easy to get to. And it was only about 60 miles from the university. So they started to gather together, and he started to put it together, and I started to figure out how I was going to take 20 people in the hills with about 13 head of horses, because that's about all I had, So, and very little experience. I'd only been an outfitter then for about 2 years. So anyway, we put it together, and he came up and called me about in June of that year. And he said, Smoke, the party has turned into 34. I said, geez, that's going to be pretty hard to get 13 horses with 34 people into the hills. So, boy, I went to work. Thelma went to work. We gathered. She actually went through Costco when it was first new. And she had 2 of those big flat carts, the big, yeah. She'd push one and pull one, and gathering food for this kind of a trip. And anyway, that's how we got started. And we started it with the Grizzly Riders at that time. And we went into the Meadow Creek area, had a successful 4 or 5 days in there, and brought them out safely. And from that time on, the Grizzly Riders was started. Now I'm going to join the Grizzly Riders, so is Eva, on the 7th here of September, up at the E-Bar-L. The Grizzly Riders did the same as I did. They got old, so they couldn't ride horses anymore. But boy, when I first started, they were all riders. They could ride anywhere. Guys like, Bill from the Boeing Aircraft Company, Bill Allen. He was CEO of the Boeing Aircraft Company. He came on the first trip. Several of the railroads had their executives or the vices or the undersecretaries there. We had a lot of really important people there. We had a man from New Zealand there. Anyway, we had a lot of people, and we gathered a lot of money for the university. I seen checks written for $50,000 on my old kitchen table that we had built out of logs and stuff in the hills, and we've done that, and now they're still running, and this will be 57th year, I think, or 56th. We attended the 50th year a few years ago. But anyway, we started the Grizzly Riders. The first year went good. The second year, he said, I'm going to take them to a new place. Let's go down to Yellowstone Park. Well, they went down to Yellowstone Park. The outfitter wasn't as good, evidently, because he didn't have the camp set up. Besides that, the camp was almost at 8,000 feet in the air. And these were all people that sat behind a desk all of their lives. And on that trip, 2 of them died. So the next year, Tom came to me and he says, we got to find a safer place. He said, we just got to find a place because we like the way you set up camp, had it all ready for us. But we got to find a safer place, and we can't ride at 8,000 feet and let guys walk up to the rivers and the lakes there and fish. Good fishing there and everything. It was a good, pretty area, but just too high for that age of people. So Tom says, well, come up with another place. And I said, how about let's go into Schaefer Meadow on the middle fork of the Flathead. And Tom says, well, where's that? And he looked it up on a map. And I said, you know, I think we can even fly them in there to Schaefer and then pack them about 4 miles down to Three Forks and make camp. And that way they'll get some horseback riding in, but they'll also have an opportunity to see a lot of the Bob Marshall from a plane. Tom thought, hey, that's a great idea. Let's go take a look. I got to find out if the fishing's any good, Smoke. So he got a hold of President Johns and 2 other guests there, Lloyd Shermer, the newspaper editor from Missoulian, and let's see, several others. And we went on a pack trip. There was 5 of us, I guess. Anyway, we went he flew in. And he said, what I'm going to do, he said, I'm going to just fly these guys in, show them that we can fly in the Schaefer. And then I want you to meet us there with a camp and then take us horseback so we can fish all these areas around there. And you'll have the camp and everything, and you'll have all our gear. So about a week before, they brought all their gear up to the house and packed up all the food and everything, got it all ready. And a day before they were going to fly in, I grabbed 5 horses. I didn't pack any mules at that time, didn't have any. So packed 5 horses and 2 saddle horses for my Wrangler and me. My Wrangler, by the way, Tom Collins had a friend from back east. He wanted his son to learn how to be a man, how to be out in the woods all the time. So here I have Dave. I had a young man by the name of Dave Ritz. Good kid, honest, sincere, husky enough to lift the loads and husky enough to do it, but didn't know a damn thing about horses or anything. And he barely had his driver's license, as a matter of fact. But anyway, we loaded these horses. I loaded the 7 into the stock truck, and we started for Hungry Horse. And we came up the Flathead just like we did today, except we used the east side, and came into Hungry Horse, and then we were going to go to Spotted Bear. So we started down that long dirt road, long way in there, and we went all the way in and got to Spotted Bear. Well, I had a friend there that had a guest ranch there. Rhoda Cook was her name, and we stayed there that night, and she fed us. And then the next morning, we packed up all their gear that we had, including the tents and the whole works that I was going to take in the hills on those 5 head of horses. And they were loaded pretty heavy. But we started out. And I can remember Diamond was at the end, and Sargum was next, and Frog was next, and then Shelda and Lady. I led Shelda. She was an old white horse, mostly pack horse, and mostly draft horse. She was big, wore number 3 shoes. You know, everybody knows what number 3 shoe is. Big. Anyway, I let them in, start up the hill, and we went out of Spotted Bear, and we went up a big log to the Big Log Trailhead, which is he said, the ranger said, oh yeah, you can just drive up there and you can park up there in the top, and then you can start in from there. Getting up that road was a real mess because the water had washed it all away, and it was rough, and the wheels would get on these rocks and spin out, you know. And anyway, we finally got up to the trailhead and packed up, and the next morning we started into Schaefer Meadow. And the ranger said, he said, you know, nobody's been in there that early. This was in June, early June. He said, you know, it's you might hit a little snow. And he said the middle fork will be pretty high in water. Anyway, we said, yeah, let's go. We had all their gear, and they had already taken off, by the way. They had flown in, landed at Schaefer, got their fishing poles out, and their vests and all that stuff, and walked down the river. We're fishing and having a great time, you know, and all that. So we started in, went in around the first big cirque, where we could see Gunsight Mountain just off to the right there, just a little ways. and we came around one corner, and there was a big snow slide about 8 feet deep. And here it was, of course, by the time we got there, it was about 11:30, and you know what happens to snow in the sun at about 11:30 in the morning? It got soft. And boy, this was a pretty big slide. It went down a long way. I tried to take a horse across it, no way. Sunk right into his belly right away. So I explored the upper end of the slide and found a way that I could get around the upper end where the snow was only about a foot deep in places and get around. So I took my horse and Sheldon and Lady and with their loads, and I led them around the top and back down on the trail and got down there quite a ways and tied them up and went back over the snow. I could walk on the snow pretty good. Of course, I'd sink into my knees, so that was not any fun. But anyway, when I got there, got back, and I said, Dave, I want you to lead your horse, and I'll take the other three, and we'll take them up the way I went. So we started. And by golly, I got up there. I put Dave ahead of me because he was riding a little short horse called Babe. And anyway, he was ahead of me, and he didn't know much. I wanted to make sure I could get him in the right spot. But anyway, we went up over the snow slide, and about halfway through that, of course, Diamond broke loose and Sargum, and down the hill they slid in the snow, and down about 50, 100 yards. And their packs all come off, of course, and came apart. So we get to the other side where I had my horse and several others, and Sheldon and Lady, and we went back down. Here's Diamond upside down. We got him straightened out, and they didn't get hurt, fortunately. They slid on the snow pretty easy, and so did some of the gear. You know, it slid right on down. Yeah, we gathered it all together, and it took us, boy, 2 or 3 hours to gather that all together, put our saddles back together, and get him back up on the trail where the other horses were. So finally, we were underway at about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And here they are expecting supper, you know. So anyway, we continued. We ran across a couple of more snow slides and finally started down Minor Creek and went by a beautiful little lake called Scott Lake. Not real deep because there was 2 moose standing out in the middle, so I knew it wasn't very deep. But the moose looked at us. They didn't pay any attention to us. We went on down, but right as I passed Scott Lake, I heard something unusual. It was a real big roar that I could hear. And I rode a little ways further, and it was the middle fork of the Flathead, and it was really roaring. And got down to the edge of it. We were still on the bank and looked across. It was about almost 100 yards where I was going to cross, because it was a shallow place where you can normally cross easily. But boy, it was muddy, looked like chocolate milk, and it had big logs floating down through it every once in a while, and stumps, and that kind of stuff. And I thought, Dave, I don't know whether we can get across. I said, you stay here, and I'm going to take Shelda. She's a good swimmer, and I'll take her across, and I'll see if I can get across. And Dave said, okay, and I'll just wait here. So I took my horse, Cannonball. And you know, when you enter fast water, you don't let your horse read the water, because if he does, they always turn and go with the current. So when you start across, you had to turn them upstream. So they're always looking upstream and working to get across. Well, about halfway across, of course, and I was above my saddle, and I slipped off and grabbed a hold of his tail, and across we went, and we got across on the other side, fortunately. So I thought, oh boy, this is going to be a little tough. So I said, Dave, I said, hollered over to Dave if he could already hear me. I was making sign language. And anyway, he finally figured out what I wanted him to do is come on across. And I said, just turn the pack stock loose. They'll join Shelda. They liked Shelda and Lady. That was their favorite mares. So they would come across. So anyway, Diamond, he was a big husky horse. He wouldn't have any trouble. But anyway, Dave started across. Well, Dave's horse was a little smaller than mine. Babe was not a real big, tall horse, but a real game to do anything. Anyway, she started across, and of course, they dropped down, And Dave sitting on the saddle, I told him before we left over there, I said, make sure you tie your reins up, put a knot in them so they don't drop down and get around the horse's feet, front feet in particular, because that's how they swim. So anyway, Dave, he gets about not even 2/3, about halfway across. And all of a sudden, Dave lets go of the reins and started. I didn't know he had epilepsy. So boy, I couldn't figure out what to do. So I took my horse and Cannonball, and we went back out and grabbed hold of Babe, grabbed hold of the reins, and led her on across, and finally got them all across. Of course, Diamond and Sargum, they went downriver a little ways. They didn't know that you're supposed to go upstream, but they rode the water out a little ways down, and we had to lead them back up and hook them all back up. And the gear all got pretty wet, by the way, and so did we. And here it is about 4:35 o'clock now. I said, geez, those guys are going to be at the ranger station. So we rode up the I think it's 4 miles, 5 miles, from Three Forks to the Schaefer ranger station. When we rode into the meadow there, it was about 6:30. And the ranger come out. He says, where'd you guys come from? And I said, well, we came across the river from Big Log Trailhead. He said, holy cow, you can't do that. Well, I said, well, here we are. And I said, are my clients here? I have 5 guests here. He said, yeah, they flew in, but they already told me to schedule a plane to fly back out at dark, just before dark. That's a good time to fly, by the way. Cold air, get on the river and fly. But anyway, he said, they're going to meet back here at the ranger station, and I've already ordered 2 airplanes to fly them back out of here. And I said, well, why don't you call and cancel that and give me an idea where's a good place to camp? He said, okay. He said, why don't you just go down the river a little ways? There's a little trail there that horses use a lot, and go off to the left there and go towards the river. When you get pretty close to the river, make camp. It's a pretty good spot there. And so we did. And I said, tell my guests when they get here that we've got dinner on. So we went down the trail, and of course we're wet and everything's wet, all the gear's wet. And we're kind of tired because we had worked a long time. But anyway, we got down there, found a nice campsite, had a little grove of trees right next to the river, and a trail that went down to the river so I get water. And we found a nice level spot, and we had some good grass there for the horses. And I said, Dave, let's unload. We unloaded all the gear there, and I started unmatting it. And I said, Dave, take the horses over and picket 2 of them. We could picket Cannonball and Babe. They were 2 good picket horses. And I said, you might want to put a picket on Shelda too. That way we'll be sure to have all these animals here. So anyway, he goes over in the meadow and starts doing that. I start setting up camp and taking everything apart. And I open up the loads, and I put a fly up first and set up a stove, and got ready to cook some supper. And as I opened the packs up, I opened one of their packs. Guess what? Here was 2 cases of Highlander beer. So that's what we saved going in there. Now, this went way before the aluminum cans. These were hard steel cans. I mean, you couldn't break them. If that had rolled down there with the new aluminum cans, I wouldn't have had any beer to worry about. But as it is, we had 2 cases of Highlander beer. So I took about a case down to the river and built a little rock dam around it and put the beer in the river, and came back up and started cutting firewood and getting the tables up so we could have dinner, and getting some chairs. We had little stools that we sat on then, and our tables folded out, and they had chairs on each side of the tables. So we could seat 8 people at our 2 tables. And by the way, earlier, one of our wranglers and my Thelma, and they had put maps on the top of these tables. I still have them, by the way. And they're covered with that plastic resin, whatever you put on them. So we set them up, and they look pretty nice. And we set up the stove and built a fire and put the meatballs on. We always had Norwegian meatballs, not Swedish. That's right. She's a Norwegian. But anyway, we put the meatballs on and started cooking and building, getting the fire going real good. And Dave come in and he says, they're all content as heck out there. They're just eating. That's all they want to do. And a couple of them wanted to roll, of course. Anyway, we sat down there and waiting a little bit. Pretty soon I heard splash, splash in the creek or in the river coming up. And I heard Tom say, hey, look at that. That's a nice fish. He was dragging in a fish. And they talked a little bit right there, and I could hear them down the river. They were about from here to the other room there, away from me. But I could hear them talking. And anyway, they put the fish in there, threw him back, actually, because we didn't have any place to keep fish. So we threw him back, and they come on up a little ways further. And then I heard Tom say, hey, you guys, somebody left some beer here. And it's cold. It's in the water. So he says, I don't think they'll care if we take 6 cans out of there. They won't even miss it. So anyway, I hear them pop. In those days you didn't pop the top, but it actually the pop came all the way off, and those are all over the wilderness, as a matter of fact. But anyway, I could hear them down there. Boy, this is neat. We got beer. And one of the guys, Lloyd Shermer, says, yeah, don't want to miss that airplane. So let's drink and go on up. Maybe we better hit the trail and go on up to the meadow so we can catch that airplane. And just then they come up the trail, and here's camp all set up, tents up, cots up, bedrolls in their tents, and coffee on the stove, and the meatballs cooking, and mashed potatoes ready, and everything was just about ready. They couldn't believe it. They said, holy cow, how'd you guys get here? Anyway, we told them the whole story, and we had dinner. That next day, the ranger came down to our camp as we were packing up to go down to Three Forks, where I wanted to take them so we could go up to Flotilla, a lake that is back of Scott Lake. Flotilla is a little hard to fish, but you can go around one bank and good fishing. It is really good fishing. Now, Scott Lake, you can catch a fish almost every time you cast there. It's pretty easy to fish there, and you can wade out in there some. You'll disappear in the mud otherwise. But anyway, I was wanting to take them down there. Anyway, the ranger came down, and he said, we can't believe you made it across there. And that was one of the trips that we had that I'll always remember. And the Grizzly Riders in that August came into Three Forks. They flew in 2 airplanes on Otter, which is a 3-engine airplane built similar to the Ford Tri-Motor, and a DC-3 that flew in there and hauled all those guests in. And then we picked them up with horses and relayed them. Some of them wanted to walk anyway, and so we relayed them down to camp. And of course, by that time, we had about 40, 50 head of horses in there. So at any rate, the Grizzly Riders was started, and they're still going to this day. And fortunately, that's what made my business, because all those executives had a good time. We showed them how to fish. We had good times with them, had good campfires. And matter of fact, Tom always played an accordion, And Dean Boley, he was dean of the forestry school. He played one of those piano things you blow into. I don't know what they call it. And there was several others there. One guy played a guitar, of course. And anyway, we always had good times. And those guys sent me lots and lots of guests all the time. I had guests from all over. One of my guests was a guy by the name of Ted. And Ted came out right after he had a serious problem in Washington, D.C. His name was Ted Kennedy. And he had evidently driven off a bridge with some young lady and got into some trouble. So he wanted to get out of Washington, D.C. And what a better place to hide than in the Bob Marshall. So we did that. And in a few years after that, in 72, 73, a man by the name of Dr. Craighead, who had been in the Yellowstone Park monitoring grizzly bear and finding out grizzly bear activities, Now, by the way, I went down there with him a couple of times, and we went into dens and all that kind of stuff. But what they were trying to do is determine why and how a grizzly bear could hibernate for about 3 to 4 months, depending on the weather, and not have to eat, drink, nothing, just lay there and sleep. Because they felt if we could put humans into hibernation, if they had a serious illness, we could put them into hibernation. Say they broke their back, we could put them into hibernation for 3 months. And guess what? They could probably get up and walk from that time on. So that was the idea. And NASA supported that idea. And so Craighead came up and went into the Lincoln Scapegoat country. And we went up on top of Scapegoat Mountain and worked up there. But at any rate, those are some of the trips that we've had in the hills that we really enjoyed, and our guests did too. And that year, I had an unusual guest because John Craighead knew somebody back in Washington, D.C. I don't know who. But anyway, he said, I've got a young man that we want to take in. He's going to work with us on Scapegoat. His name is Steve. And he said, I want him to take your packing class. So Steve come up, and I don't know whether anybody here knows Tom Powers, but anyway, Tom Powers and him took the same packing class. Tom sat right beside Steve, and it was kind of unusual because Steve brought 2 paying customers into my packing class. And I thought, geez, that's pretty nice. And Steve at that time was working down at Bud Osmond's ranch, at the OC Ranch on Lolo Creek. And I think Bud's the one that brought him out here. But anyway, we went through the packing class, and then that spring, we packed him into Scapegoat Mountain with the Craigheads, John and Frank, and they were going to do a grizzly study on the top of the mountain. And what they wanted to mainly do is find out the habitat. And anyway, this young man, his name was Steve Ford. His dad happened to be the president of the United States, and the 2 paying guests I had were Secret Service. And it was pretty good. When they arrived in Missoula, we went to the country kitchen. They arrived in Missoula, and I went to the country kitchen to have a little breakfast and talk to them about what the conditions are. Here these guys are in suits and Oxfords. I don't know whether I don't think anybody knows what an Oxford is anymore. It's a low shoe that isn't very strong. But anyway, we sat there and talked, and he said, listen, we came with our suits and our Oxfords. We want you to rent us everything we need. And we got a briefcase full of money to do that. And I like that part. Anyway, we leased them their sleeping bags, their underwear, their belts, their socks, their toothbrushes, everything. They didn't have anything that they could take in the mountains, including their coats. I have one of the coats yet, and I have one of the sleeping bags yet. Because when they left, of course, they didn't want them. But anyway, we took them in the hills. The idea of that particular trip, by the way, to the top of Scapegoat, was to do a telemetry study that NASA wanted to do with a satellite that was going over the Earth every, I think, 29 hours or something like that. It wasn't 24, but it was. Anyway, they wanted to take pictures so they could identify military movements, highways, cities, groups of people from this satellite. They were a little concerned about Russia at the time, of course. And anyway, what we were doing, we went in there and we marked out 52 10-meter squares. Meters, I don't know why they use that. I don't know why they use footage. But anyway, 10 meters square on the top of Scapegoat. They put it on a map, marked all these on. And our business up there, I packed them up to the head of Cabin Creek, and then we hiked up to the top of the mountain. And our business was to go to each one of these 10-meter square blocks on the map and count everything that's in there. I mean, everything. I mean, whatever it is. Some guys found a tin can, or they found a shovel, or whatever. Anyway, that's what we did. We counted all the plants, everything, identified all the rocks we could. Of course, it's all limestone on top of the mountain anyway. So we counted all the vegetation. and they would fly over and take pictures of that. And I have the map at home yet, and it shows the vegetation of the top of Scapegoat Mountain. One of the plots that I went out and took a look at was unusual because a preacher and his wife and his son-in-law and daughter took off from Great Falls, and they were headed for Seattle, and they flew up over the Scapegoat Mountain, ran into a lot of trouble, and made a circle with the plane, evidently what looks like a circle anyway, and crashed into the mountain there. And when they found the airplane, it's still there, by the way. The wings are spread out like that, and the plane they rolled back the top of the cabin to get the people out, who were dead, of course. And there were hymnals all over the ground right there, probably 50 scattered out. They had them in the luggage compartments there. But anyway, my job was to go to this one square, with this one 10-meter square. That 10-meter square happened to be most of a wing of an airplane. So I wrote down aluminum. That's all it was. And then I had, of course, a few little plants here on the side, like biscuit root and a couple other little plants that were there. Turned that in, and lo and behold, the satellite image when they flew over was exactly what they thought it would be. It was 99.3, I think, accurate to what was on the ground. And we're still using that intelligence, by the way, flying over Russia or any other country, and we can tell you exactly what's there from that imagery. And that's kind of interesting because when I get that map out, I can point one little speck on the map is the wing that I surveyed myself. But we've had a lot of experiences. I'm probably the only one that has had John and Frank Craighead. They hiked down off of a Scapegoat to have a good meal because they were eating a lot of dry food up there, and eat a good meal at my camp and fish for a day on the Danaher. And I've got pictures of Steve Ford, John and Frank, and two of the Johnny, that's John's son, and got a picture of them standing in the Danaher. I'm not going to take any more of your time. Anybody have any questions or anything you'd like to add? Yes.
That's actually an airplane in Big Prairie.
Yeah, at Big Prairie. Yes. And that's a Ford trimotor, by the way. And that plane crashed in 38, I think. 39. John Fraley might know better.
I know they dragged it off the runway over
Yep.
the area where it's
Yep.
a little tour there.
Yep.
Volunteering for them.
Yep, same here. All my guests went to that. And it still has Johnson Flying Service on one side of the plane. And I took in some airplane pilots that flew for several of the big companies. And one of them had actually flown that particular plane when it was new. And they bought it brand new from the Ford manufacturing company. By the way, they didn't just make cars. They made Ford trimotors, 3-engine airplanes that flew very slow. Matter of fact, I got the jump out of a couple of them, smoke jump. And we liked them because they could slow down to about 50 miles an hour and still stay in the air, and you could almost step out and walk. But anyway, that plane crashed in, I think, 38. And Dick Johnson was flying it. It was a brand new one. They had bought it that spring, a brand new Ford trimotor. They had flown in a lot of stuff all over. They landed on sandbars and everything else with it because it could slow down slow enough to land almost anywhere and take off anywhere. And anyway, Dick had a job to fly in a bunch of equipment and stuff to the Big Prairie Ranger Station. And Big Prairie at that time had a nice airfield there. And they flew into that airfield, Dick did, and they had supper there, and he liked to take off just before dark because of cool air, good flying. And as he took off, his right wing hit a big ponderosa pine at the end of the airfield. The stump of that pine tree is still there. Of course, we cut it down since. But anyway, spun around and the plane crashed right there. The brand new airplane. Well, and Dick got hurt pretty bad, by the way. And so Bob Johnson, his brother, come in and picked him up in a Travel Air. Nobody knows what a Travel Air is. It's a great airplane too, and I've jumped out of that a lot of times because it would haul 5 people, and it was a slow flying plane also. They have one down at the museum in Missoula that they can fly yet. It flies. But anyway, he came in and picked him up the next day and took him to the St. Pat's Hospital in Missoula, and then immediately went out to the airfield, which was right where Sentinel High School sits right now, exactly where it sits. Right next to the fairgrounds. Some of the old buildings were there at that time. But anyway, he went out there, walked into their office, which they had a 1 secretary and about 4 mechanics. And Bob and Dick did all the flying. And he walked in, he says, "Okay, everybody, you're done. We're going to quit. We're done. We just wrecked our first brand new airplane. All the other airplanes they had were trimotors or triplane or biplanes, and they were pretty well wore out after World War I and the beginning of World War II. So he said, "You're done. We're closing up. We're not going to have Johnson Flying Service is out of business," and that was in about September. Anyway, these guys all started to look for work and find out the lady that was running the office, she was looking for work. And about 2 weeks before Christmas, Dick and Bob were both invited. Dick, of course, recovered. But anyway, Dick and Bob were both invited to a Christmas party at the Florence Hotel, a dance party. Anyway, they went to that party, Christmas party, and a guy by the name of H.O. Bell, who owned the Ford Motor Company in Missoula, who had just finished selling the Forest Service 40 one-ton trucks. So he was rolling, and he sold them. I've got pictures of them all lined up in a row. Lots of those pictures, that kind of pictures. Anyway, they were at this party, and H.O. Bell come over and he talked to Bob and Dick, and he said, why don't we start this flying service up again? I'll give you some money here to get it started. And that's what they did. They started the flying service, started the first of the year of that year, and has been going ever since until about 1985, 86. And that's when they sold the Evergreen. But at any rate, that's kind of the story, what they call the airfield out at Missoula, Johnson Bell Field, named after Bob Johnson and H.O. Bell, because that's how it saved itself. And yes. Yep. Yep. That's right. The tail of that plane broke off, and there was somebody built a wooden door for the tail because you could live in the tail pretty easy. Yeah. That's probably where you lived. Yeah, the Big Prairie is noted for that. Lots of that kind of stuff. Lots of trappers spent time in there. Yes. You still sell your DVD? I don't sell it, but all you have to do is contact the University of Montana, and they'll sell it to you. It's a PBS documentary.
It's online. You can find it online too.
Yeah.
It streams on PBS.
Yeah.
Free, actually, too.
Yeah, 3 miles an hour. That was, I don't know why they did that, but one of my backcountry horseman friends, he knew another guy that did these PBS things, and they wanted to do something a little different. So him and a young lady, they came in the hills with Mac Long and Connie Long and myself and Richard Tampke. And we made a trip, and they filmed that thing in about 5 days, and it was all done. He said, that's the cheapest film we ever put out. And he said it cost us about $20,000 because he rented a special rigging that goes on a helicopter so that he could lean out over the airplane and take pictures of the Chinese Wall and all the country. And he rented that, and they fastened it on a helicopter, and he took a flight over the Bob Marshall and did that. So you have some aerial flights, pictures in that. Yeah, before drone, what's a drone? Yep. Anybody else? Yep.
I have a million questions I could ask you, sir, but the one I want, and I realize it's just your opinion, but do you think that the Wilderness Act could pass today? And what's your opinion or thoughts on the future of the environment movement in the United States today?
First of all, the Wilderness Act would not pass today. Not a chance. Not even, it wouldn't even be introduced.
Yeah.
And fortunately, it passed in '64, thanks to a man from Montana. His name was Mike Mansfield. He was the senator, the majority leader in the Senate. But anyway, Mike went to 2 or 3 of his colleagues in the Senate and traded them their vote. He would vote for one of their bills if they would vote for his bill. And that's how it got passed, just like that. And it was a trading situation. Also, we went on I'll tell you I'll try to make this quick. We had a centennial train. In 1964, Montana turned 100 years old. And we built the Northern Pacific Railroad wanted customers on their trains to come to Montana. Matter of fact, they offered all the outfitters could have an office in Minneapolis at the train headquarters, and you could book people back there. You'd go back, and they'd put you up for a week back there while you do that. But anyway, some of the guys out here, they decided they want to get a centennial train going. So they started getting volunteers and people that were interested in it. And the first thing they did is the Northern Pacific Railroad managed, it isn't the Northern or whatever they call it now, the Milwaukee or whatever it is. But anyway, the Northern Pacific Railroad, they provided us, I think, 32 cars, but something like that. Mm-hmm. I think it was. Anyway, they provided us with railroad cars. And the first thing they did is took about 4 or 5 boxcars and made them into stalls so they could put horses in them and mules. And then we had sleepers, and they had dining cars and everything on this. And then they gathered a lot of the outfitters, and it was Montana Outfitters and Guides Association that really started the idea. And then they had an artist who got, I forget how many, but quite a few, like maybe 40 pieces of plywood, 4x8 sheets of plywood, and he painted all kinds of scenery pictures on those plywoods. And one of them is in Whitefish right now. Yet. And anyway, they fastened them to the outside of the cars, and they went. They took a lot of outfitters took their horses, and I have a set of elk quarters. June knows what they look like, and those went to the Centennial train and went to cities. We've stopped in cities like St. Louis and Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Chicago, and all those. Did a parade and put our horses all back on the train, and then took them on to the next city. We ended up in Washington, D.C. And I think this is part of why or how the Wilderness Act got passed, because we made a parade and paraded right down to the Capitol. And they had all mules, stagecoaches, covered wagons, all kinds of stuff. Indians, a lot of Native Americans were there and did their performance dances and so forth. We had one railroad car that had $1 million worth of gold displayed in a case in there. You could go in and look at it. And anyway, we did a parade. They did a parade and went down in front of the Capitol. and did all their thing. We had a young lady who was Miss Montana. Quigley was her name, and she had 2 pistols and she was a rodeo rider, trick rider, and she would do a performance, and she had all the clothes, that fits that particular show. But anyways, we went down to there, and guess who walks out on the steps of the Capitol? It was Senator Mike Mansfield wearing a cowboy hat, and the next guy right beside him was President Johnson, and then wearing a cowboy hat, of course. He did, by the way, almost all the time. But at any rate, they gave it a little talk, and everybody clapped, and everybody there. And Quigley, she pulled out her 2 pistols and shot them into the air about 3 or 4 times. And of course, they captured her right away and hauled her away. But it was so funny. Mike Mansfield, first of all, started to laugh. And then President Johnson laughed so hard that his white hat fell on the ground, and the Secret Service had to run over and pick up his white hat and put it back on him. But they laughed. But shortly thereafter, the Wilderness Act was passed in September 3rd, and he signed it with no questions asked. So I think that made a lot of difference. We went on to the World's Fair in New York, or they went on to the World's Fair in New York, where Spunky, or not Spunky, but Miles City, the owner of Miles City, we brought him there, and the owner took Miles City, and to my knowledge, he lived his life out in New York City and not in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, where he should have been. Any other questions, quick?
Did you bring books to sell?
I think there's a book, somebody that's going to sell books here.
Yep, yeah, right in front, over there in the foyer, there are books for sale, and we will be sitting here at that little table next to this beautiful little plastic horse, and we'll be signing. But before we do that,
Yes.
2 things.
Yep.
One, we need to take our picture that we like to take with our audience.
Oh.
I know you don't like it, but it's fun. And
I
Greg,
like the audience.
not the picture, but it's such a nice memory. And Greg wants me to remind everybody that we have a beautiful cake over here for
Yes.
the 60th anniversary of the Wilderness Act.
And it is a beautiful cake, by the way. Everybody ought to take a look at it before anybody sticks a knife in it.
But we all should stick a knife in it because we should eat it. I think that's the plan.
I don't know, but it smells.
Right, so we bring it up there, right? And then eat it, and there's some water and other coffee for anybody.
And remember, above all, this is a celebration of the Wilderness Act, 60 years. And it has had no law against it. Nobody has made a move to eliminate it to this day. And I think that's, you bet. No lawsuits. It's had no lawsuits. And it is still alive and really cooking yet today. And Montana is fortunate enough to have several of them, I think 7 wilderness areas in the state of Montana. Am I right? I think that's right.
15, yeah.
15?
Mhm.
No. Yeah, counting some of the little ones.
Mhm.
How important has Thelma's advice been?
I could not have run the business at all without her. Her advice is, hold up your hand, Thelma, stand up there. Yeah, there you go. Yep. Yeah, she's the one that ran the business. It's all I did. Yeah, she ran the business. Is all I did is take guests in and have a lot of fun, which I did. I enjoyed every day. No days that I was in there. It could rain all day and it'd still be a good day. Fact it is, I had a couple of guests rode into camp. We were camped on Youngs Creek at the Hole in the Wall, and it rained all that day, really hard. I mean, it was so we laid over. We just stayed there, and we had a fire going and had a little coffee going and all that going. And about 9 o'clock at night in the dark, here comes a man and a little boy, about 12, rode into camp. The boy was riding bareback, no saddle. And of course, they were drowned. I mean, they were absolutely wet. And he had a pack horse. And he said, is this the Young's Creek Trail? And I said, yep, right there. And he said, well, we got to get out to see the lake. I got to go to work tomorrow morning. And it was raining to beat heck. I mean, just pouring. And this little kid got off and warmed himself up with a fire real quick and had we gave him a cup of hot chocolate at that time. And the gentleman had coffee. And a few minutes later, they went over and got on their horses in the rain pouring down. And as they rode out of camp and just got out of the sight of the campfire, I could hear the little boy saying, "Hey, Dad, ain't we got fun?"
He's probably still packing.
I would guess he is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would guess he is.
Well, also has a guest book up here that you would like everybody to sign.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for
Thank
coming.
you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Audiobook. We should do an audiobook.
Yeah, it's all in the works.
No, I